Yeah, I mean, today what we're going to be doing is looking at the notion of, you know, Pan-Africanism and colonialism and post-colonialism, and through two important thinkers, through two important nationalist thinkers, I think. And the two of them, the two thinkers, I mean, one obviously people might know less about is Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of independent Ghana. And then the others, obviously, Nelson Mandela, which more people would know much more about sitting in this room. It's quite difficult to pitch it because, you know, often when I teach the history of the African National Congress, or I teach the Nelson Mandela, my students, third year, even honors, know very little. They seem to also know very little about the actual dates of when things happened. And being a historian, obviously, I'm very into when things happened and the exact dates and the actual evidence, what we have evidence for to substantiate. So I'm very into that, and I know it's not, goes against kind of like more postmodernist readings of the world, but I think my whole discipline is against that, so I can't really endorse it. But I think what I want to do today is I want to talk about what colonialism is, have a discussion about post-colonialism, and also very importantly, I think we need to have a discussion about the nation state and what we mean by nationalism and nation. People tend to mean very different things by this, and I think yesterday when Lenny spoke and spoke about how the nationalism of Pan-Africanism was important, it was in response to something very particular. We'll also speak to that as well, so we can be on the same page. And then I will do a sort of brief biography of both Nkrumah and Mandela. And I think when you start thinking about Mandela's biography, it becomes very apparent that, you know, Mandela was Mandela wasn't politically very consistent. He changed his views a lot. And I know today it's very fashionable to sort of, you know, say he's not cool and to just have this whole anti-Mandela sort of stance that's happening around. I'm obviously not for that at all. I really respect what he did, and I might have much more rose-tinted lenses when I deal with him. But one thing that he's not very consistent on is politics. He keeps on changing his views politically and his ideology. But one thing that's constant is the nationalism. That stays. He is a nationalist. He's very committed to that, and he's clear about that from the very beginning. And so I think that's why he fits so well into these discussions. Okay, so, you know, colonialism took many forms. And yesterday, Dinga hinted, and Richard, when they were having a discussion, spoke to some of those forms that colonialism takes. Now, we have to be very wary of the different forms colonialism takes, because then we need to understand, firstly, what shape does the anti-colonial struggles take in different contexts, but also what happens in the post-colony is determined by what the colony looked like in the first place, all right? Now we have several types of colonialism, and also colonialism doesn't end in one period, okay? And some people describe some things as colonialism and other things as not colonialism. I mean, the classic example would be a discussion about the apartheid state, right? There's various splits about whether the apartheid state is also just colonial state, and then if the apartheid state is a colonial state and Palestine is like South Africa during apartheid, is Palestine a colonial state, and so on. So the discussions become quite complex. So I'll just give you some brief sort of analysis and then we can get into it. So you get a variety, different types of colonialism. In South Africa, like you have in the United States, like you have in Australia, it's settler colonialism, all right? You have a large majority of Europeans settling within the colonized space. Now that's not common across the continent. You have different levels of settler colonialism. For example, in India, they had thought about making India a settler colony, but they couldn't because it just wasn't viable in terms of temperature, in terms of disease and so on. But at any given time, there were more English people living, say, in India than there were in South Africa. So even though it wasn't a settler community, the white population, the European, the colonizing population was very large in a place like that. And so what happens, and then you have a place like Ghana where there's some sort of operation of colonialism entrenched within that system, but it's also not a settler society. Now, somewhere like the Congo, that's the most extreme example. There's no investment. It's literally a sort of garrison fort that's there, and it's declared the personal property of the King of Belgium, and then when they leave, they just basically close up and leave. And there's no investment. There's no investment in infrastructure. There's none of those things because there's no concern for the population that's living there. So there are these different forms of colonialism. Then within that, you get different forms of how colonialism works differently in the Francophone world, the Lusophone world, and so on. So there's also that difference. So forms of colonialism look very different in Latin America than they do to our continent, or the United States or Australia. So these are the different things. Now, what happens when we have the colonial power leaving? That's what I will call it, because we're still debating whether we are post-colonial or whether we are neo-colonial. That's another discussion as well. So when the colonial power leaves, they leave differently in different places. Now, if you are in India, for example, they leave on this particular date in 1948, right? And then the British Raj, everyone leaves and walks through the gateway of India, and that's it, they're gone. All right? There are few people left for the next year or two to wrap up, and then afterwards, that's it. There's no colonizing population left in a space like India. The same in Ghana, the same across the continent, right? In the Congo, it's more extreme. But what happens in a society like South Africa, like the United States, which we often forget is a colonial space? What happens in those spaces? What happens in a space like Australia, where the settlers, where the colonizing population is there, and they now see themselves as part of that space, all right? And we know the history. There's a division that comes into being very quickly, where the settlers, the colonized settlers who are living in the colonies, begin to turn against the colonizing imperial powers themselves and fight for independence in a variety of ways. This happens in the United States, it happens in South Africa, and so on. You have that system developing. Therefore, the struggles that come in the post-colony or the neo-colony in the settler colonialist states is very different, right? For example, in India or in Ghana, it very quickly becomes apparent in the neo-post-colonial moment who the enemy is. It's like, well, we still have the state system, and all that's happened is we've replaced the people that were there with a different set of people, but the apparatus and the modes of exploitation and everything have stayed the same. So people very quickly begin to develop a critique of this. But in a settler society like South Africa, it's very difficult because you still have a large population of people, and when people are reacting, they are calling for the removal of white power still. And in a way, you know, and when that white power is removed, if it is eventually, and if it is really white power, what are we going to be left with? Are we then just going to be like India or like Ghana or Nigeria? But then we realize that the modes of exploitation and oppression are still the same because we haven't changed the system. So I think those are really important questions that we need to grapple with and think through when we're talking about when we're having these discussions. The other discussion, the other point we need to think about is neo-colonialism. I mean, it is really evident in a lot of situations how the old colonizing powers still retain power in a lot of parts of the world through policy, through organizations like the World Bank, through structural adjustment programs that are put into place in a variety, in a large parts of the world. I mean, somewhere like Latin America, the United States takes over from the European countries, and it's absolutely clear their intentions to control that region of the world. So many argue that we are still in that neo-colonial moment, and we actually haven't come into the post-colonial moment. And then that leads to discussions around decolonization. And what do we mean by decolonization? Did we get decolonized in 1994? All right? And if not, why? What does each individual person mean by decolonization? Because I know when I speak about decolonization, I don't mean a sort of replacement of one nationalist elite with another. I don't mean that we just turn the tables and we keep the power dynamics. I mean there's a new form of society developing, that there's a new way of doing stuff, right? But can we ever get to that new way of doing stuff? I mean, these are very difficult questions for us to grapple with. But whenever I mention decolonization, it's always assumed what I mean is some sort of chauvinism, is bringing in some sort of chauvinist canon into being, especially if you're talking about curriculum, for example, which is not at all what I'm thinking about. So for me, it's those questions that we have to discuss and think about. And if it is possible at all, given global power relations and how things are. Okay, so then that takes us to the nation state. And why do we have these nation states? And why is the concept disputed? What do people in this room think of when they think of a nation state? I mean, what do they think of when they think of nation? How do you define it? How would you define a nation?
The word nation.
Yeah, for you, when you.
Like I said the other day, when we spoke about, when I said that I'm a nationalist, I said that to me, a nation is, for an example, as white people as a race are a nation, and black people as a race.
Are a nation.
Are a nation because we share common identity.
Okay.
All of that stuff. And as Africans, we are a nation, let alone colonial borders.
Okay.
That is my understanding.
Okay, so it's a racial understanding. Yes. So you have a racial understanding of nation.
Yes. When I'm saying that I'm a nationalist,
yes,
it means that my politics are beyond South Africa. They
yes.
include every
yes. But it's about race. It's yes. about African.
Yes.
Okay. Anyone
it's
else?
Race and matter, continent.
And the continent. Yes. So if you're an African from Brazil, would you count?
Yes, that's what I'm saying.
Okay.
In
okay.
Africa, I need a diaspora.
Okay. That's what you. Okay. Anyone else? Yeah.
People with a shared politicized identity.
People with a shared politicized identity.
But I think there is a territorial element
mm-hmm.
that nation is in a particular place. It's defined by a certain set of borders.
Yes.
And you also get this idea of citizenship,
yeah.
of what it is to live within that
mm-hmm.
set of borders, and from that you draw a whole set of that's a framework through which, for example, you would draw on particular rights
mm-hmm.
or access to certain resources, employment,
yes.
Residence, etc.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, it's a claim to make. You can make a claim because you belong within these categories to get things as well, to access things from the state. Okay? So, I mean, I think, and then, I mean, so to have a nation, you would need a state. Would that be correct? No. You don't think so? No.
I mean, there's a claim that Palestinians are, they don't have a state.
Mm-hmm. But some would claim there is a state.
Navajo Americans, it's called the Navajo Nation.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have a state.
Mm-hmm.
They claim the reservation for a state. They don't have. Like there are lots of Kurds
mm-hmm. are a nation. Yeah.
A nation,
but they don't have a state. Okay.
So another thing, I think, this concept of the state, it goes to the religion, because it,
to where?
Religion,
okay.
yes, because Muslims, even if a Muslim is from South Africa, another one from South Arabia, they call each other brothers. They belong to the same nation because they share those religious ideas. So to say that in order to have a nation you need a state, I think it doesn't.
Okay, so you could not have a state. Okay.
Of sharing, the same maybe ideas or race to me as an Africanist.
Okay. Okay. Anyone else wants to add anything before I continue? Okay. Fine. Okay. Yeah, I mean, so there's a variety, so in this room there's a variety of different understandings about what we mean by nation, all right? And also what you mean by state, and whether, I mean, most people seem to think that you don't need a state to have a nation. I would argue that, I mean, it depends how you see a state and how you theorize a state. But I think you do need some sort of organizing principle around which people form a nation. But traditionally, the nation state people aren't really, because it's such a sort of, it's something that's so highly contested, people have different conceptions about a nation. And we have to take that very seriously. I would not say that Muslims are a nation. I would say that Muslims are Muslims. They have a religious affinity. They use the word nation, but that does not mean that they are a nation. That's just, I mean, that's just them having a particular, that in fact, with Islam it's really interesting because your first allegiance is to Allah and to the religion, you then are outside of nation states. Effectively, that's what happens within Islam. So I wouldn't personally call it a nation, but it's a set of religious beliefs that people adhere to, and so it's a different form of community making, right? Some people like Stalin would argue that community making is what makes a nation. You also need to, and when it comes into being, it's usually tied to these moments in Europe around the 15th and 16th century. It's disputed. Very modern forms of the nation state really come into being around the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, where they form borders, strict borders within Europe. Okay, a lot of places gain their independence from other sort of kingdom states, and a lot of people argue. I mean, that Marx would argue that it's when the feudal system dies away and you need something new that you develop this nation state. But it's tied to boundaries, it's tied to geography, it's tied to that intellectual production that happens in that moment that gets people to see that they now belong to a nation state. Borders are key in that, okay? And we can't really talk about nations without talking about borders. And if we want to reject those borders, we have to radically rethink how we're going to think about ourselves as human beings. And I don't think the term nation then is sufficient. It's a valid term to use. I think we have to think about something else, another word, because for me the term nation comes with too many sort of exclusions, too many things that are excluded from it, but also too much of specificity. Okay? And now the notion of nationalism also evolves and changes throughout history, and one of the key moments that it really comes into being many people, including someone like Dipesh Chakrabarti, who's from the Subaltern Studies group, argues that the sort of crisis in Europe in the middle of the 20th century with the rise of fascism is the sort of crisis of nationalism, right? It's this crisis of nationalism where it's taken to its ultimate logic, and what ends up happening is the exclusion of people on ethnicity and race, all right? And to me it seems, I mean, if you think about French nationalism as well, a lot of nationalism that's coming out of Europe that then comes to be how we understand nationalism globally, a lot of it has to also do with the creation of outsiders within Europe, Jews, Roma, Muslims, and so on. So it's from its very beginning, like for example in France after the Dreyfus affair, which has to do with the sort of accusations against a man for being treasonous, a lot of it has to do with people's own discriminatory beliefs. And it seems to me that that forms the basis for it very often. And we have to be very wary of that. Now, a lot of people, and a lot of the anti-colonial struggles, what they do is they're kind of saying to these empires, to these imperial powers, you have yours nation states, you have defined your independence in that way. That's what we want. Okay? And now when we're having discussions like yesterday about the failure of the post-colonial nation, right? We're talking about why it fails. You know, I always wonder, and when I'm reading about these nationalists, are we surprised it failed? Did they ever ask for anything more? Did they want to change the system, or did they just want to replicate that system? And I think the clue is in the fact that they kept on asking for their nationhood to be recognized. And in that, a particular group of people have to be left out, a particular set of structures have to be developed within society, and it's like not reimagining the world in a new way. I mean, you know, Nkrumah was a great Pan-Africanist, but he accepted the borders and then sought to build alliances, strong, very strong alliances across those borders and across the oceans, both to the east and the west. But they still accepted the limit, that was the limitations, all right? That's what I would argue. Now, I mean, even in India, it's absolutely ridiculous. You have the partitioning of India in 1948. Over 1 million people are killed in that partition of India. It's absolutely brutal and bloody, and it's accepted. It's just accepted, like this is what would happen. A man, his name is Radcliffe, arrives in India, divides India according to what he thinks is the best way to divide India. One individual takes 3 months to do it. He creates something called the Radcliffe line, which still holds today, and that's how he separates an entire group of people. And it's so farcical that the separation of India, or the creation of it in a particular way, there's no commonality between people. People don't share the same history, they don't share the same language, they don't share the same food, none of those things that would supposedly make you a nation, all right? And so this is what I think we really need to question and think about. Now, Nkrumah, I'll just go into a bit about his life, and then we'll have a bit on Mandela. I know people here would have probably know much more about Mandela than I do, and have engaged and thought about this much more. So if we can, in the question session, have much more of a conversation around that, if people want to add things in, that would be great. So the Mandela sort of biographical stuff would be kept to the minimum, but I think with Nkrumah we need a lot more sort of stuff, flesh to work with, to think about. Nkrumah was born in 1909 in the Gold Coast, and he studied to be a teacher in Accra. Okay, and he studied to be a teacher, and he was very much he was very religious young man, and he worked for several years in a variety of schools, and they were all church schools, Roman Catholic schools. So this is also, once again, the role of the missionaries, the role of the church in the education of these leaders. This is something that's key, and religion in their lives as well. So Nkrumah, once he had done his teaching for several years, wanted to advance his studies in philosophy. And in 1935, he went to England. It was from England that he was going to try and get a visa to go to the United States. Now, while he was in London, like people like C.L.R. James and George Padmore and so on, he heard about the invasion of Ethiopia, Abyssinia. And this really sort of impacted on Nkrumah. Now, Nkrumah was a socialist, internationalist, like C.L.R. James, like a lot of individuals in the Pan-Africanist movement, but they had noted that there was something wrong when people's sort of freedom and liberty is so disregarded, and that this was the case, and this was specifically what was happening on the African continent. So this is when a lot of them begin to also specifically think about the African question. And we can't take this out and excise this from their history because we want it to fit into a communist history or a socialist history. We have to be very clear that this was definitely there. It was there with James, it was there with Nkrumah, it was there with a variety of people who were socialists but realized they needed to take questions of what was happening on the continent very seriously. And along with James and so on, Nkrumah and them started the sort of support committee for Ethiopia, and it was through this that he met a whole group of other individuals. In October 1935, Nkrumah managed to leave the UK to go to the United States, and he enrolled at the Lincoln University in Pennsylvania. And he completed in a very short time 2 Bachelor of Arts degrees, 2 bachelor degrees, one in arts and one in theology. And then he also earned a Master's of Science degree in 1942, and in 1943 he received a Master's in Philosophy. So by now he's got 4 degrees. Okay, so he's obviously a severe high achiever. He also used to use this time to preach a lot. So he was developing his socialist understandings, but he hadn't at this time abandoned religion. And he used to use this time to preach a lot in a variety of churches in Philadelphia and New York. Once again, you see the role of the church being a space for people to talk about politics, notions of liberation, and so on. And in 1943, during this period, he becomes very close to C.L.R. James, along with a variety of other Trotskyist intellectuals who are in the United States, such as Raya Danayevskaya. I'm not saying that right, but I'm sure someone else can correct me. And he says it's during this time that he learned about how underground politics works and so on, and the key people to do this were people within this group. In 1945, he returns to England, and he wanted to study at the London School of Economics. Okay? And it is when he returns to England that he meets George Padmore, who is a West Indian Pan-Africanist. And they plan the 5th Pan-African Congress in Manchester. Okay? And George Padmore was also, he was born in the West Indies, in Trinidad, and he was also very much a sort of socialist Pan-Africanist, and he, like W.E.B. Du Bois, ended their days in Ghana once Nkrumah had become president. So while Nkrumah was developing his sort of socialist line of thinking and his commitment to socialism, he also founded a committee called the West African National Secretariat. Okay? And this was, as well as becoming the vice president of the West African Student Union. And this was with a view to gain independence in West Africa. Okay? In 1947, Nkrumah was asked to return to the Gold Coast and to join in the movement that was developing there. And what begins to happen is it's a time that's highly fractious within the Gold Coast, and there is a whole lot of protests that are happening. And in one incident on the 28th of February 1948, police fire on a whole lot of ex-servicemen that are protesting, and they're protesting the rising cost of living, they're protesting exploitation and working conditions in a variety of ways. And 3 people are killed, and about up to 60 people are injured during this. Okay, and this spurs on riots across Accra. And the government, the British state at the time, suspected that it was people like Nkrumah and the United Gold Coast Convention that had led these protesters, and they arrested Kwame Nkrumah on the 12th of March 1948. Okay? And his arrest led to even more widespread unrest and protest. And so the British realized their error, and Nkrumah only spent a month in jail and was released on the 12th of April.
Can I just ask a question?
Yes.
At this point, what is the basis for his popularity in Accra?
He doesn't have that much basis. He's come in to join the United Gold Coast Convention that already has a base, all right? And it's individuals, in fact, it's one of his very close comrades, Boyake Dankau, I don't know if I'm saying that right. He is actually the person that has a lot of support and popularity, but he comes in as a sort of person from the outside and becomes a key member within that movement. And this is a really important question that you ask, because nationalist movements tend to do this all the time. They tend to bring individuals they think is important and put them into leadership roles. The African National Congress does this, and even the Indian Congress in India. Someone like Gandhi had no base in India. Some leader in India thought he was good, Gokhale in fact, and brought him in. and put him into some leadership position, because it's about their own sort of battles within that party. That's why they're doing this. So Nkrumah is one of the individuals that is brought in that way. But interestingly enough, what he does is once he's released from prison, and he has obviously some name for himself after this, he then decides to tour the entire country, well, it's not a country yet, but the entire region, all right? And he goes on this like months-long tour of the region, sometimes walking through a variety of means of transport, and it is through this sort of mobilization around himself that he comes to be seen as an important youth leader within the movement, all right? And interestingly enough, Gandhi does the same thing. When Gandhi goes to India, when he returns to India from South Africa in 1914, no one knows who he is. And the person who brings him into the Congress, Gokhale, has passed away. So he's rejected by people like Nehru and the other groupings within the Congress and said, well, you don't really have a base, so leave. What he does is he goes on his famous train journey throughout India, and he then develops a huge mass-based movement, and he comes back to the Congress with that mass-based movement, and he comes back more powerful than the other members in the Congress who don't have that mass base. Okay? And Nkrumah does something very similar in this instance. And one of the other things he does from this is he also gets a large base, he builds a large base from the cocoa farmers of the region, right? And he gets them to rally to his cause. He also, importantly, gets women to rally to his cause because he's talking about suffrage for women. He says this is very important, right? And he's the first person to begin to put those into those debates. And he also gets a lot of trade unions to ally to him and his political project. And then what he does is in 12th of June 1948, he develops his own new political party. It's called the Convention's People's Party. Okay, and it's so interesting to me to see continuously these developments of parties within these nationalist movements. But that's the different story in South Africa, where we don't seem to do that. You know, the ANC seems to keep, we have a lot of obviously alliances and different groups coming up, but the ANC seems to stay. Once it forms itself very sort of in a particular way, it seems to stay that way. They obviously change and become mass-based and so on, but they don't go through these name changes and all of these things and breakaway groups to the same extent that you find in other parts of the world. And so in response to his mobilization and his work, the British state then calls a commission of a very few middle-class elite Africans and says, you know what, as a sort of piecemeal thing, we will give you guys the vote. So we'll give you the vote, and you'll only be able to vote if you own property. Okay? So they don't want to give up power, but they want to bring the elites onto their side. Okay? However, Nkrumah then organizes what is called the People's Assembly. Okay? And it's here that with a variety of other people, they say that they would in no uncertain terms call for a universal franchise, and a universal franchise without property qualifications. Okay? But in October 1949, these sorts of amendments were rejected by the colonial administration completely. Okay? When this was rejected, Nkrumah called for a campaign of positive action in 1950. And this includes things like civil disobedience, non-cooperation, boycotts and strikes. Very similar, what's happening in South Africa, the Defiance campaign around that same period, the idea of civil disobedience, non-cooperation, boycotts, strikes, so on. It's very interesting that this is the route they seem to want to go, despite the fact that even the Pan-African Congress in Manchester said, you know, get your freedom by any means necessary, right? So there's a talk of it being by any means necessary, but it's done through these. And I can't help but think that India getting its independence through these measures, through these so-called non-violent measures, would have had an impact on people's thinking. But if you look closely at the history of India, and you look closely at the figures and the amount of people that died in the violence ensuring independence, and since then, you'll realize it wasn't a non-violent peaceful negotiation. The settlement wasn't non-violent, it was actually incredibly violent. It was just non-violence in terms of the spectacle that was created around it. And so once this was called, Nkrumah and a whole lot of his CPP supporters were arrested and they were sentenced to 3 years imprisonment. At this time, both international and internal resistance and protests and campaigns were launched against the British state, and it is then that they decided to leave, okay, the Gold Coast. And they organized an election for between the 5th and the 10th of February 1951. Nkrumah was still in jail when the election was held, but his party had won by a landslide victory, taking 34 out of the 38 seats. Nkrumah was released from prison on the 12th of February, and the governor of the Gold Coast, Charles Adden Clark, had then asked Nkrumah to form a government on the 13th of February. Now we have to realize that at this time it was a sort of union state. They're still within the realm of the Commonwealth. It was a sort of negotiated settlement. We will decide what we're going to do once we have the system in place. So it's a sort of, he hasn't fully taken control. Britain hasn't fully relinquished all control. It's a sort of agreement that they have going on for a few years. And then on the 6th of March 1957, Nkrumah then, after a lot of work behind the scenes, after really trying to, and really developing a sort of framework for Ghana moving forward, declares that Ghana is independent. Okay? And in 1960, he then announces plans to develop a new constitution. So Ghana is now independent but becomes part of the Commonwealth. Okay. In 1961, he's now president, and in 1961, Nkrumah lays the first stone for what's called the Kwame Nkrumah Ideological Institute. All right? And this is really important, and it's actually quite fantastic. I'm all for training people in a particular way, so I think it's all fantastic. He has this institute where all civil servants have to go to learn the line, right? And they have to have what he calls ideological orientation. And he says this has to be in place over even their religion, right? And I mean, we just don't train civil servants at all to do anything in our country. But I just find it really interesting, this notion of training people within this, within the line. But perhaps if we train people within, you know, how to make the state work as well would probably be better. Anyway, it was all about training people in the party ideology, right? And getting people to know what the line was. So Nkrumah becomes increasingly socialist once it is in power. I mean, we knew he was always socialist, but he begins to put in place a variety of socialist policies and a variety of practices. Okay, and he really sort of expands a variety of industries: forestry, fishing, cattle breeding, and so on. He also launches the Volta River project, which is providing irrigation, water for irrigation, and huge amounts of hydroelectric power to the region. He also becomes a key member in the non-aligned movement. So not only is he developing this Pan-Africanism, he's also developing a much more internationalist perspective. And he's one of the key members, along with people like Nehru and so on, who developed the non-aligned movement, which was not going to take a side in the Cold War, where they were either not going to side with Russia or they were not going to side with the United States or with the Soviet Union. They were going to sort of use both of those groups to decide to get what they needed for each other, for themselves. But interestingly enough, all the individuals, the leaders of the non-aligned movement, were socialist. So we knew where their leanings lay. Both Nkrumah and Nehru, key members, were open socialist. So, you know, Nkrumah also really didn't just speak about Pan-Africanism, he really put it into place. He opened up a variety of institutes, and he brought people like W.E.B. Du Bois and George Padmore and so on to live in Ghana. And it was here that Du Bois was going to develop an encyclopedia for the continent. And in fact, all his stuff is still there. I just learned a few weeks ago that Gayatri Spivak is going to be going there to work on all these papers on Nkrumah that's there. Gayatri Spivak, the subalternist. And I just find it absolutely ludicrous that she should be doing this. But I guess if you're famous, you can do whatever you like. So, I mean, she's not even mentioned Nkrumah's name once in her entire life, but she's got this big grant to go and look at him. Anyway, so what begins to happen is by 1954, this becomes a really key point in Nkrumah's governance, because while he's putting socialist policies into work, he's not really taxing the elite, right? He's not really making it difficult for them. But the price of cocoa goes up massively. It goes from £150 to £450 per ton. And what Nkrumah does is, instead of letting the cocoa farmers take that extra windfall, he takes that money into the state. And immediately he becomes alienated from this group of people, from a major constituency, and it's them that actually brought him into power. And they begin to turn on him. And it's during this time, in order to work against a citizenry that's turning against you, that he becomes more and more authoritarian to implement what he sees are these socialist ideals that he wants to put in place. Okay? There's a variety of strikes that are happening, and in fact the very trade unions that supported him, he now turns on them, and he puts into place something called the Trade Union Act, which makes strikes illegal. Right? And he also, during the same year, puts into place something called the Preventative Detention Act. All right? And this gives the government powers to arrest and detain anyone and charge them with treason and arrest them for 5 years if they are deemed a security risk. And in fact, he imprisons a whole lot of his colleagues and comrades who he worked with very closely for many years. And you know, so he's getting increasingly authoritarian, he's getting increasingly separated from the people and from struggles on the ground. And it is during this time that there are a variety of different sort of attempts that are made to assassinate him. And this impacts on his fear and his increasing paranoia. And so he more and more comes out of public view and sort of hands over responsibility to what's called National Security Service, okay, and his personal guards. And then in 1962, a whole lot of members of the CPP were brought up on charges in a plot to blow up his motorcade. Okay, and there was not really any evidence for this, and so the case was thrown out. But in response, Nkrumah throws out the judge, rather than saying, okay, we will have this, and institutes a second trial. Okay, and this doesn't really work out, and so they were given their sentences they were death penalty, but they were commuted to life imprisonment in the second trial, but. He is not happy with this result, so he gives himself the power to remove all judges as well. Okay, so you see very quickly how this is going, and it's not unusual for this to happen. And I think we really need to speak about the psychology of why this happens to individuals in power. I mean, there's a variety of things that are happening, and people are. And leaders like this do get paranoid, they do become more and more authoritarian, and I think it has to do with the nature of having nationalist heroes as well and nationalist leaders, where you look to one individual to deliver rather than affirming the entire struggle that was there continuously that led to people's independence. Anyway, so there's eventually a coup is initiated against him in February 1966 when he's visiting North Vietnam and China. and he was not allowed to return to Ghana. And so he lived out the rest of his days in Guinea as a guest of President Omar Sékou Touré. And it's actually now, interestingly enough, when he's in exile, that he writes he writes really important work, political conscientisms. I can't get the name. Conscientisms. Anyway, which is a really interesting take and a look back at the sort of movement and what had happened and what had went wrong and what we have to do to make things right. In 1972, he dies at the age of 62 of cancer, and after his death, he was flown back to Ghana and he was buried in Nkrumah, where he was born. Now, you know, after his death, once again, he becomes this big figure. He's seen as someone really important. He's once again idealized. People begin to, now that he's dead, I guess, and less dangerous, begin to reinscribe in him the sort of nationalist hero modes of being. And this seems to happen continuously. I mean, when Madiba died, there was a massive sort of reinscribing of power onto this in one individual. And yeah, we need to think about how nationalist politics does this. I'm going to go on to Mandela now really quickly. I'm running out of time. I'll just do like 5 points on Mandela and we can talk about him a bit more in the discussion. But I really want to ask us to think about what was Mandela's politics? What do we think Mandela's politics was? Right? Like I mentioned earlier, it keeps on evolving and it keeps on changing. And some people might see this as being politically astute. Others might see it as very sort of negative readings, might read it as being opportunist. All right? But as I said earlier, the one thing is clear from his politics is he remains a nationalist, a radical nationalist. That's why he can give up on all things, but even when he goes to New York in the early 1990s, while making a whole lot of sort of compromises in South Africa, will stand up in New York and say there's no way we will give up on the liberation of our Palestinian brothers and sisters. Right? And in no uncertain terms does he make that very clear. That's why he still supports Gaddafi, right? Because he is about that nationalist independence, right? And he's very consistent on that. That's something he's very consistent on. And we need to think a bit more about him in those terms. Okay, so he was born on 18 July 1918 in Mvezo in Mthatha, and we all know he was given the name Rolihlahla. And he comes from a royal family, as everyone knows, and he grew up in the guardianship of the Tembu region chief, Jongitaba, and he says it was here that he really learned how to do a politics where you include people, where you bring people in. So consensus has to be reached by agreement, okay? Because in democracy, it's like, okay, who wants to go for drinks afterwards? 5 people put their hands up and one person says no, the one person's unhappy and no one cares. We've gone. But here it's about consensus building. It's about bringing people on board. It's really a different sort of way of doing politics. And I know, you know, I get very annoyed with that because when I often go to, like a lot of activist movements, social grassroots movement operate in that manner. If you go to a meeting of Abishlali Basam Jandolo, everyone has to speak. Everyone has to have their turn. Everyone has to feel included. Everyone has to be okay with the final decision. That takes hours and hours and hours and hours. And I'm like, just please make a decision already. We need to get going. So it's that form of consensus building. And we can see that later on in his politics, that sort of consensus building about trying to bring people into the project. In 1937, he goes and studies at a Methodist college in Fort Beaufort. And he basically, you know, this is a really interesting time in his life. He says, you know, for the first time, his world until this was a very Xhosa-speaking world, and that was all he understood to be his people. And then he goes and studies here, and he realizes that, you know, there's people who speak a whole lot of different languages. There's people who speak Sotho, and so on. And he becomes really interested in the wider world, and then begins to expand his concept of who should be included into his world. And he obviously, it's also a time when he takes up boxing, right? And we know he loves boxing. It becomes a huge part of his life. And even when he goes to Cuba, the first thing he wants to do is see the famous Cuban boxer, what's his name? I forget who. It's a fantastic, amazing video of him going to meet him, and he's actually like a whole head taller than Mandela himself, who's so massively huge. And so then once he finishes, he goes and studies at Fort Hare, and he's studying English, anthropology, politics, native administration, and Roman Dutch law. And he says when he arrives, he's not really interested in politics. He's really interested in, like, you know, ballroom dancing and getting dressed up and doing plays and stuff. And as you know, Mandela obviously loved to be dressed up. He dressed spectacularly, and he really was quite charming and all of those wonderful things that he had, those qualities. But he says it's here that he meets people like Oliver Tambo and so on, and they really begin to radicalize him. And he then becomes involved in the SRC there. And the key thing that they begin to boycott is the conditions around food. All right? And he says that the quality of food was really unacceptable. And he was then, after this boycott, suspended from the university, and he left without receiving a degree. He then goes to, when he tries to return, he returns home, he realizes that his uncle had arranged a marriage for him and his cousin, and they obviously don't want to get married, so they leave and they escape and go to Johannesburg in April 1941. His first job was when he gets to Joburg? In the mines, right? And he sees capitalism in action. That's really interesting, because he goes to the mines, he sees capitalism in action, but it takes him very long time to be convinced by any sort of communist or Marxist socialist ideology. So I wonder, when he sees capitalist in action, what is he thinking about capitalism at the time? That we should just have it? Or is he actually, because he doesn't mention being worried about the modes of exploitation at the time. No, I know, but you can still see people going underground. I mean, you're the security guard. And so, anyway, so it's here that he meets, Walter Sisulu and so on, and he gets involved within the ANC politics. It's also here that he continues to advance his education, and he begins to work for a sort of liberal or left law firm, and he also meets his first wife, Evelyn Massa, who he gets married to. Okay, and then in 1943 is a key date in Nelson Mandela's life, because it's when he meets Anton Lembede. Okay, and there's so little work done on Anton Lembede, it just astounds me. But Anton was a absolute African nationalist and really opposed any sort of racially united front against colonialism. He was, and he really disliked the communists. So Mandela really takes on Lembede's views, and he becomes very influenced by Lembede and his ideas for self-determination. And he actually takes him very long to get rid of those ideas. In 1947, Lembede passes away. And it's here that even at this point, Mandela is not convinced by, he's appointed within the ANC Youth League as the secretary, but he's the sort of president of the ANC Youth League at the time, Peter Mda, really wants a sort of, wants to have the sort of ANC coming together with the communists. And Mandela tries to oppose this, but is defeated. Okay, and so I think that's really important, and he continues with the sort of very close nationalist politics, but by 1950s he changes his mind, and he begins to make friends with people like Moses Kotane and so on. And he says it's the period that he began to read Marx and Engels and Lenin and Stalin, and he became very convinced by this idea. Now, I don't know if he became convinced by it or whether the sort of party was moving along without him, because it was looking to unite more broad-based, so they could do things like the Defiance campaign and so on. In 1952, the Defiance campaign begins, and we know that Mandela is arrested with a variety of other people on the 30th of July under the Suppression of Communism Act, all right? And they're given 9 months hard labor, but it was suspended for 2 years. Okay. He was also banned, given a 6-month banning order, so he couldn't really attend anything. The Defiance campaign kind of petered out by 1953 because of the sort of attacks on the leadership of the campaign. But we can speak more about the Defiance campaign because it was really amazing, sort of fantastic work around bringing people together in a very disciplined manner, politically and so on. Julian Brown, his new book that's going to be coming out deals with this, this issue, and it's really amazing stuff. In 1954, his marriage is, begins to fall apart, and they get divorced, him and his first wife. And, you know, and then there's a variety of sort of negotiations and work that's happening, and Mandela in this period also meets Winnie Madikizela Mandela. Now there's a new book on Mandela's biography that's just been written by Colin Bundy. It's that pocket book, and in it he says that Mandela married Winnie, a woman who was as beautiful as a beauty queen but came with no politics. Okay, and now this is absolutely wrong. Right? It's just blatantly incorrect. And so I think it's very interesting, the role of Winnie as opposed to Mandela, and how a very nationalist reading of the mother of the nation begins to develop as someone who's subservient and under Mandela and influenced by the father all the time, who is Mandela, the father of the nation. But in actual fact, Winnie was always an independent individual. And so I think that's something we have to think about. He marries her on the 14th of July, 1958. Okay, and I mean, this was during the time of the treason trial, because he was arrested in 1956 on high treason, and the treason trial continues for 2 years with the sort of each judge being thrown out of court and the case just continuing until it's eventually thrown out of court completely. Then in 1962, Mandela basically, 1960s, you see a period of radicalism within Mandela, the formation of the MK. He begins to travel the world to kind of set out the ideas of the African National Congress. He also travels to get to sort of get training and so on, in military training. In 5th of August 1962, that's a famous date, Mandela was arrested, and a lot of people say he was arrested because of an informer within the CIA. We don't really quite know. And then while he was in prison, on the 11th of July 1963, the police raided Lily's Leaf Farm, which, by the way, is now a gated community in Johannesburg, and it's called Lily's Leaf Farm still, just so you'll know. And he was arrested there, and they were all arrested, and some of the documents that were found also mentioned Mandela's name, and then the Rivonia trial begins, and we know the outcome of this trial. What's really important about the trial is the very important speech from the doc that Mandela gives. And while everyone assumed that they'd get the death penalty, they were all sentenced to life imprisonment. And then we know the rest of the story. I'll leave it there for now.